Have you ever wondered how some of the greatest falls in life can lead to the most powerful restorations? It's often in the deepest pain, the hardest losses, and the heaviest burdens that grace shows up in the most unexpected ways. We all experience seasons of brokenness, whether it's a fall from grace, a dream that shatters, or a loss that feels impossible to heal. But what if these falls aren't the end of our story? What if they're the beginning of something greater? Something more profound than we could ever imagine. This is the story of Mephibosheth, a man who, despite losing everything, encountered grace that would transform his life in ways he never expected. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to ask for your support. If this content speaks to your heart, please give this video a like. It helps us reach more people with this message. And if you enjoy diving into content like this, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's grow in faith and understanding. God bless you. Mephibosheth was born into royal blood, destined for a throne, but in a single moment, everything was ripped away. As a young child, he had it all: a future in the palace, a life full of promise. Yet, at just 5 years old, tragedy struck. The kingdom of Saul, once powerful, collapsed due to a fierce battle with the Philistines. Saul and his son Jonathan were both killed in this battle, leaving Mephibosheth, the rightful heir, with no throne and no family to turn to. Exiled and forced to flee for his life, his royal destiny was replaced with a life of fear, isolation, and uncertainty. Once surrounded by the comforts of the palace, he now lived in hiding, uncertain of his future. But God's story doesn't end with the fall. It's in those darkest, most hopeless moments that grace often shows up when we least expect it. Mephibosheth's story isn't just about the pain he endured. It's about the restoration that followed. His journey would be marked by the fulfillment of a promise made by a king to a friend. David, the new king of Israel, had sworn to Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father, that he would show kindness to his descendants. David's promise was not only about providing for Mephibosheth, but about honoring a covenant of love and friendship that transcended politics. When the time came, David sought out Mephibosheth, bringing him back to the king's table and honoring the promise he had made. Mephibosheth's story became one of redemption, healing, and grace, a grace that only God can provide. It's a story of mercy finding us, even when we feel undeserving. What happens when a child, unaware of the legacy they carry, is thrust into a world of turmoil and uncertainty? What happens when that same child, the forgotten prince, is confronted with grace, despite his fall from greatness? Mephibosheth's life teaches us that grace is not about being perfect or deserving it. It's about being seen, remembered, and called to something greater than our brokenness. His story challenges us to ask, how will our stories unfold? What does it mean for us, broken in our own ways, seeking hope and redemption? Let's embark on a journey into the life of this forgotten prince and discover how the grace of a king not only healed him, but transformed his life in ways beyond his wildest dreams. Mephibosheth's story begins long before the exile, long before the pain and the fall. It starts in a world of royal promise, where he was the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel. In the grand halls of the palace, surrounded by luxury and power, Mephibosheth had a future that seemed secure. He was born to inherit a throne, destined to carry the legacy of Saul. But behind the opulence of the palace walls, there was mounting tension. Saul's kingdom was weakening, torn between the loyalty of those who supported his reign and the rising power of David. Saul's failure to unite the kingdom left it vulnerable to division and rebellion. The political instability within Saul's court was becoming more evident. Though Mephibosheth was too young to fully grasp these complexities, his kingdom was crumbling. The future he once thought was certain was rapidly slipping into uncertainty. As a young boy, Mephibosheth lived in the safety and comfort of the palace, unaware of the growing unrest around him. His days were filled with the carefree joys of childhood, playing through grand hallways, making the palace his playground, and enjoying the privileges that came with royal life. But even in these seemingly innocent moments, the shadows of his family's predicament loomed. Saul's inability to solidify his reign and the growing support for David began to undermine the kingdom's stability. Even the youngest prince, Mephibosheth, was indirectly affected by the political shifts, though he didn't fully understand it. Tensions between those loyal to Saul and those who supported David's rise were mounting. And although Mephibosheth was unaware of the full scope of these conflicts, the instability was starting to take its toll on the kingdom. Despite his young age, Mephibosheth carried the weight of a royal legacy. He was the last surviving heir to Saul's throne, and his future was tightly bound to the fate of his family's kingdom. He may not have understood the depth of this responsibility, but it would soon become apparent. Little did he know that the life he knew, filled with the comforts and safety of the palace, was about to be shattered. Saul's reign, weakened by internal strife, the rise of David, and external pressures, was crumbling. The royal family, once powerful and revered, now found itself on the verge of ruin. Mephibosheth's place in that world, once certain, was suddenly in jeopardy. But what happens when a royal future slips away? When a world of privilege crumbles into chaos? What does a child born to inherit a throne do when that future is suddenly threatened? Mephibosheth's life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. The kingdom he once knew would fall, and with it, everything he thought was secure. What happens when all that was promised fades away? The world he knew was on the verge of collapse, and amid this chaos, an unexpected call would come, one that would change his life forever. The story of Mephibosheth is about to take a dramatic turn, and his journey from prince to exile is about to begin. The winds of change were already sweeping through the land, and Mephibosheth's world was about to be shattered. The story of his fall begins on the battlefield, where the once mighty house of Saul faced its final battle against the Philistines. Saul, though once a great king, had seen his kingdom slowly erode under the weight of disobedience and division. His leadership was in question, and the united front of Israel was fracturing. The Philistines, relentless enemies of Israel, were capitalizing on this disarray. Saul and his son Jonathan, both heroic figures in Israel's history, stood together on the battlefield. However, the battle's outcome was grim. The Philistines emerged victorious, and Saul's reign was brought to a decisive end. The consequences were not just political. They were deeply personal. The royal family, once revered, was now at the mercy of a new era. Saul and Jonathan, two towering figures in Israel's history, were killed in the battle, and the loss was devastating for the kingdom. But for Mephibosheth, this was not just the end of a political dynasty, it was the sudden and heartbreaking loss of his father, his grandfather, and the life he had known. The future that once seemed secure was now shattered in an instant. Mephibosheth, the young prince, suddenly found himself orphaned and without a throne. The kingdom that had promised him power and greatness was now in ruins. The child who had once played freely in the palace was thrust into a world of fear and uncertainty. The personal tragedy of losing his family was compounded by the political upheaval that accompanied Saul's fall. The news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths reached the palace quickly, sparking panic and chaos. The royal household, realizing that the old kingdom was gone, feared for the survival of the remaining members of the royal family. Mephibosheth's nurse, overwhelmed by the urgency of the situation, grabbed the young prince and fled the palace in a desperate bid to protect him. But in the rush of escape, a devastating accident occurred. As they fled through the palace halls, the nurse stumbled and dropped Mephibosheth. In that moment, the young prince suffered a permanent injury that would leave him unable to walk. Not only did he lose his family, but this injury would mark him for life. The fall was not just physical. It symbolized the collapse of his entire world. His future, once full of promise, now seemed completely uncertain. What happens when a royal bloodline falls into chaos? When a young prince's world is turned upside down in an instant? How does a child, born to inherit a throne, respond when the world they knew crumbles? Mephibosheth's life would never be the same again. The fall was not just a loss of privilege. It was the loss of a future, the loss of an identity, and the loss of security. But in this moment of devastation, something remarkable was about to unfold. Even as the kingdom fell, a promise made long ago was waiting to be fulfilled. Mephibosheth's journey was just beginning, and the story of redemption and grace was about to take its first steps. In the chaos that followed the death of Saul and Jonathan, the royal household descended into panic. The fate of the remaining members of the royal family hung in the balance. News of the defeat spread quickly, and with it came the fear that the new king might seek to eliminate the remaining heirs of Saul's bloodline. Mephibosheth, being the last living descendant of Saul, was a direct threat to any new monarch seeking to establish their rule. In the confusion, Mephibosheth's nurse, knowing that the typical practice after a king's death was to wipe out the old royal family, feared for the young prince's life. With no time to spare and the palace in disarray, she hurriedly grabbed Mephibosheth and fled the palace in a desperate bid to protect him. Her actions were driven by a deep, instinctive fear for his safety, knowing that no one with Saul's blood would be safe once a new king came to power. The flight through the palace halls was frantic. The nurse, her heart racing, carried Mephibosheth with all the urgency she could muster. Despite her best efforts, disaster struck. In her panic, she stumbled, and in that moment, Mephibosheth fell. The injury he sustained would forever alter his life. The young prince was left unable to walk, his future physically and emotionally shattered. The immediate pain was intense, but the far-reaching consequences of the fall were even more profound. His royal destiny, once clear and bright, was now marked by uncertainty. No longer could he run freely in the palace halls, the world he had known now slipping beyond his reach. The fall was not just a physical injury, it was the symbol of the collapse of his entire world. Mephibosheth, orphaned and now crippled, was thrust into a life of exile and uncertainty. The future he had once been promised, a future of greatness and power, was now replaced with a life of obscurity and fear. His identity, once tied to the throne of Israel, was now overshadowed by the fall, both literally and figuratively. The nurse, though terrified, tried her best to comfort him, but she knew that this injury marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Mephibosheth's journey was about to take a drastic turn, and the challenges ahead would reshape him in ways he could never have anticipated. What happens when everything you once knew is lost in an instant? When a royal bloodline falls into chaos and a young prince's world is turned upside down, what is left to cling to? Mephibosheth's life would never be the same again. The fall was not just the loss of privilege. It was the loss of an identity, the loss of security, and the loss of a future he had been raised to expect. But even in this moment of devastation, something remarkable was waiting to unfold. In the midst of this pain and brokenness, a promise made long ago was about to be fulfilled, and a story of grace, redemption, and restoration was just beginning to take shape. After the fall, after the loss of everything he had known, Mephibosheth's life was plunged into an abyss of solitude. The kingdom he had once been destined to rule now seemed like a distant dream. No longer a prince with a future, he was just a boy hidden away in the shadows, forced into exile in a forgotten place, a village called Lo-debar. This desolate land, buried among hills and far from the eyes of Israel's kingdom, became Mephibosheth's home. Lo-debar, meaning no pasture, was a place where hope seemed to have died, a place where dreams withered away like the barren land around him. It was a place where the broken and forgotten found refuge, but it also symbolized the death of the future he once believed in. The small, humble house of Machir, a kind and generous man, became Mephibosheth's refuge. While Machir offered food and shelter, Nothing could replace the comforts of the palace or the promise of a throne. Mephibosheth spent his days in silence, grappling with the loss of everything that had once been his birthright. There were no servants to attend to him, no tutors to teach him, and no friends to share his burden. The once bright future of a prince was now replaced with the quiet suffering of a forgotten soul. The memories of the palace of laughter, of playing in the royal halls, seemed so distant. Yet, even in this solitude, the weight of his former identity as a prince remained a constant reminder of a past that could never be reclaimed. Years passed in Lo-debar. Mephibosheth grew from a boy into a man, but he remained in exile, trapped by his circumstances and the trauma of his fall. Though his body could not walk, his mind and heart were restless, haunted by questions. Will I ever be seen again? Will anyone remember me? The man who had once played in the grandeur of the palace now spent his time in quiet reflection, often gazing into the distance as though searching for something he could never quite grasp. The passage of time had done little to heal the wounds of his soul. It was in Lo-debar that Mephibosheth learned to survive without hope, to live in silence, and to exist without truly living. His identity as a prince had been stripped away, and all that remained was the heavy silence of his exile. But even in the depths of his exile, a flicker of light remained. Mephibosheth's story was far from over. In the darkness of Lo-debar, he would soon learn that even the most forgotten places can be the starting point of a remarkable transformation. A king whose heart had once been bound by a promise to his friend was about to remember him. And in a place where no one expected hope to spring forth, Mephibosheth's journey was about to take an extraordinary turn. What happens when a forgotten prince is suddenly called to the king's table? How does the grace of a king find a man lost in the shadows of the past? Mephibosheth's story is about to be rewritten, and it will be one of redemption, restoration, and grace. Amid the peace and prosperity of his reign, King David's heart was stirred one evening by a memory, a promise made long ago to his beloved friend, Jonathan. It was a promise that had been tucked away in the corners of his heart, overshadowed by the years of battle and the responsibilities of leadership. Yet, as the night grew still and quiet, the weight of that promise resurfaced with clarity. David had sworn to Jonathan that he would show kindness to his descendants, even after Jonathan was gone. It was a vow of loyalty, love, and grace. David, now firmly established on the throne, was ready to fulfill that promise. But who among the house of Saul remained? Who was left that David could show kindness to? David called for his servants, asking if there was anyone still alive from the house of Saul. Ziba, a servant who had once served Saul, was summoned and brought before the king. David's question was simple but powerful. Is there anyone left from Saul's house to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Ziba's response was careful. He hesitated before speaking, aware of the political implications of such a request. There is one, Ziba said, a son of Jonathan, who is lame in both feet. His name is Mephibosheth, and he lives in Lo-debar. At these words, David's heart was moved, for he remembered the promise he had made to Jonathan. The memory of their deep friendship and the covenant they shared was now more than just a memory. It was a call to action, a moment of divine destiny that would bring redemption to the forgotten prince. David immediately sent for Mephibosheth, ordering that he be brought to the palace. It was a message that Mephibosheth never could have anticipated. A royal summons, delivered by the king's servants, made its way to the humble house in Lo-debar. Mephibosheth, who had lived for so long in isolation, must have been overwhelmed. The life he had known, the life of exile and obscurity, was about to be shattered. He must have wondered, why now? Why me? His mind, filled with doubt and fear, couldn't fathom what was happening. A man who had been forgotten by the world was about to be brought before the king. But what awaited him? Was it punishment for his lineage, or was it something far greater? What does it mean when a forgotten prince is remembered by the king? When a promise made in the past is suddenly fulfilled? Mephibosheth's story was about to take a dramatic turn. The king who had once shared a deep bond with his father, Jonathan, was now extending grace to Mephibosheth in a way that would change his life forever. But in the midst of this moment of divine intervention, Mephibosheth had no idea what was coming. A seat at the king's table, a place of honor and redemption, was waiting for him. And it would be in that moment of grace that Mephibosheth would discover the truth, that his story was not defined by his fall or his exile, but by the promise of restoration and the grace of a king. David's heart was set on fulfilling his promise to Jonathan, and the wheels of destiny were set in motion. The search began for Mephibosheth, the last surviving son of Jonathan, the final thread of Saul's royal legacy. David's longing to honor his covenant drove him to act, and he summoned his closest servants. Among them was Ziba, a former steward in Saul's household, who had first-hand knowledge of the family's history. When asked if anyone remained from the house of Saul, Ziba hesitated, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. He understood the risks of naming a surviving heir, especially one tied to the fallen regime. Yet loyalty to truth compelled him to speak. "There is still a son of Jonathan," he said, lame in both feet, "living in Lo-debar." Ziba's words carried the weight of tension and uncertainty. In ancient times, the arrival of a new king often meant the end of the previous bloodline. Ziba, knowing this history, may have feared that revealing Mephibosheth's location could put the man's life at risk. His hesitation was not without reason. Many kings would have seen Saul's descendant as a threat to the throne. But David was not like other kings. His promise to Jonathan had not faded with time. Instead, it burned in his heart, a vow waiting to be fulfilled. Ziba's revelation became the key to unlocking a moment of grace, one that would forever alter the course of Mephibosheth's life. David's response was immediate and resolute. Without questioning Mephibosheth's condition or worth, he commanded that he be brought to the palace. This was not about political gain or public image, it was about covenant. David remembered Jonathan, not only as a prince, but as a brother in spirit. The memory of their loyalty, sealed in the midst of war and uncertainty, returned now in a time of peace and power. This was the fulfillment of a sacred bond. What stirred in David's heart was more than compassion. It was the divine echo of a promise made beneath the stars, a moment of honor that no throne or crown could diminish. But what happens when a man, long forgotten and living in the shadows, is suddenly thrust into the light? How does a crippled exile respond to a royal summons? What thoughts flood the heart of someone who believes their story is already over? The next chapter of Mephibosheth's journey was no longer written in sorrow, it was about to be rewritten by grace. As the king's messengers traveled the dusty roads to Lo-debar, the silence that had marked Mephibosheth's life was about to be broken. A voice from the throne was calling him, not for judgment, but for restoration. What would he find at the end of that journey? The answer would change everything. The long, dusty roads from Lo-debar to Jerusalem must have felt like a lifetime to Mephibosheth. For years, he had lived in isolation, forgotten by most, carrying the weight of exile and injury. But now, for the first time in years, he was summoned by none other than the king himself. The news that reached him was a mix of disbelief, confusion, and fear. A royal summons was not something someone like him could have ever imagined. Mephibosheth, who had spent so many years in hiding, could hardly comprehend why the king would want him. What was the king's intention? Was this a trap to punish him for his family's legacy? Mephibosheth's mind raced with doubt and fear. He had known nothing but abandonment and exile, and now he was being called into the very heart of the kingdom he had once belonged to. The journey to the palace was both physically painful and emotionally overwhelming for Mephibosheth. His legs, still crippled from the fall, made the travel difficult, each step carrying the weight of his past. The shame of his family's fall, the loss of his birthright, and the years spent in obscurity all followed him like a shadow. He had spent his life avoiding attention, staying out of the royal court's sight, and now he was being summoned to face the king. Mephibosheth could not understand what awaited him at the end of this journey. The stories of the king's greatness, his wisdom, and his power only added to the dread in his heart. Mephibosheth had once known a life of privilege, but now that life seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. His future was uncertain, and he could not imagine how his past would be received by David. When Mephibosheth arrived at the palace, he must have felt like a stranger in a world that once belonged to him. The grand hallways, the towering walls, and the servants who once would have bowed before him, all of it must have seemed overwhelming, foreign. He had not seen the splendor of the palace in years, and now, standing at its gates, he was unsure of his place. He was no longer the young prince, the heir to a throne. He was a crippled exile, a forgotten soul. The weight of his injury, the stigma of his family's downfall, and the unfamiliarity of the palace walls made every step feel heavy. Mephibosheth was a man torn between fear and hope, unsure of whether the king's summons would bring restoration or condemnation. But what happens when a man, broken by time and pain, steps into the presence of a king who remembers him? Mephibosheth had no way of knowing, but he was about to receive something far beyond his expectations. He was about to discover that grace does not seek perfection, it seeks presence. As Mephibosheth stood before the throne, the king's words would change everything. David was not calling him to condemn him, but to restore him. And as the throne room doors opened, Mephibosheth's life was about to be completely transformed. The story of the fallen prince was about to give way to the story of a prince restored, a man redeemed by the grace of the king. As Mephibosheth stood before the throne, his heart raced. Each step brought him closer to an unknown fate. He had spent so many years in isolation, and now, standing before the king, he could hardly comprehend what was happening. His fears of rejection and judgment weighed heavily on him. Mephibosheth had once been the heir to a throne, but now he was a crippled exile, a forgotten soul. He feared that his appearance, his injury, his family's fall, and his status as an outsider would define him in the eyes of the king. Would David see him as a threat, a symbol of rebellion, or as someone to be cast aside, never to be remembered? But as Mephibosheth approached, David's gaze met his with something unexpected compassion. The weight of his fears began to lift. David did not see him as a symbol of shame, but as the son of his beloved friend Jonathan. In that moment, the shame of exile, the years of solitude, and the fear that had held Mephibosheth captive seemed to melt away. The king's gaze was filled with warmth and understanding, not the harsh judgment Mephibosheth had feared. David saw beyond Mephibosheth's physical brokenness and acknowledged him as the son of his dear friend. The acceptance in David's eyes reassured Mephibosheth that he was no longer forgotten. David spoke to Mephibosheth with words that would change the course of his life. "Do not be afraid," David said. "I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." The power in David's words was not just in their promise of land, but in their declaration of restoration. This was not just a political gesture. This was an invitation to a life Mephibosheth had never dared to hope for. The king's promise was a healing balm, not just for his physical injury, but for the wounds in his heart and soul. Mephibosheth's past, full of rejection and shame, was now being replaced by honor and grace. What does it mean when someone who has been broken by life's circumstances is welcomed back by grace? Mephibosheth's transformation was not just political. It was deeply spiritual. As he sat at the king's table, he was no longer defined by his fall, his injury, or his family's past. He was a man redeemed, not by his own merits, but by the grace of the king. The king's table, a place of honor, now became a symbol of his restoration. The broken prince, once lost and forgotten, was now made whole in the king's presence. The table was not just a place to eat at, It was a place where Mephibosheth would forever belong. His story of fall and exile had now been rewritten into a story of grace and redemption. The king's invitation to Mephibosheth wasn't just about land or position, it was a call to grace. To be invited to the king's table was to be embraced, to be seen not as an outsider, but as a son. For Mephibosheth, this moment symbolized a shift in his entire identity. No longer was he the crippled exile, living in fear and obscurity. In the presence of the king, his past, full of pain and rejection, was erased. He was no longer defined by the fall of his family, the shame of his injury, or the exile that had marked his life. Instead, he was restored to a place of honor and dignity. As Mephibosheth took his seat at the king's table, it was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The pain of his past, the loss of his family and birthright, seemed to fade away. Sitting among the king's sons, he was treated with the same respect and care as anyone else at the table. No one saw his injury, no one saw his brokenness. All that was visible was his presence, his place at the table, and the grace that had brought him there. For Mephibosheth, this moment was more than just physical restoration, it was a transformation of his heart. He had been lost, forgotten, and now he was found. He had been cast aside, and now he was welcomed into the very heart of the king's family. The table became a symbol of the covenant that had been fulfilled, of the promise that had been kept. It was a place where Mephibosheth could finally experience belonging. No longer did he have to hide in shame or fear. The table was a place of acceptance, where all were equal in the presence of the king. It was not just about sharing a meal, it was about sharing life, about being part of a family that welcomed him fully. Mephibosheth's seat at the table marked the end of his exile and the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He was no longer a man defined by his fall, but by his redemption. But what does it mean for us when we come to the king's table? Just as Mephibosheth found a place of grace and redemption, so too are we invited into the presence of the King of Kings. We too are broken, flawed, and scarred by the choices of our past. But in the presence of the King, we are offered grace. The King's table is not for the perfect. It is for the broken, the lost, the hurting. Just as Mephibosheth was welcomed despite his injury, we too are welcomed despite our failures. The King's table is a place of redemption, a place where we, like Mephibosheth, can find belonging and experience the grace that can transform our lives. What does it mean when the King calls us to his table? It means our story is about to change forever. Mephibosheth's journey is a remarkable tale of redemption and transformation. Once a forgotten prince, living in exile, his life was changed forever when he was invited to sit at the king's table. This invitation wasn't just about returning land or wealth, it was about restoring Mephibosheth's identity. For so long, his life had been defined by exile and rejection, his family's fall a burden he could not escape. But in the presence of King David, those markers of his past no longer had a hold over him. David's invitation showed that Mephibosheth's worth was not tied to his past mistakes, his injury, or the shame of his family. Sitting at the king's table, Mephibosheth was no longer the outsider, hiding away in Lo-debar. The table symbolized more than just a physical place, it represented belonging. Mephibosheth had been restored to his rightful place in the royal family. His brokenness, both physical and emotional, was no longer the focal point. At the table, he was seen for who he truly was, a son of Jonathan, loved by David. His transformation wasn't just about receiving a seat at the table. It was about the healing of his heart, a restoration of his spirit, and the reclaiming of his true identity. The king's table was not just a place for a meal, it was a symbol of grace. It marked the moment Mephibosheth accepted that he was no longer defined by the fall of his family or the hardships of his past. He was welcomed into the king's presence, not because of anything he had done, but because of the love and grace David had shown him. Every meal shared at that table was a reminder that Mephibosheth was chosen, valued, and redeemed. The grace extended to him healed not just his physical body, but his soul, allowing him to finally accept his new life. But what does this mean for us? Just like Mephibosheth, we too are invited to the table of grace. We are invited into the presence of the King, not because of what we've done or how we've earned it, but because of who we are in His eyes. The King extends an invitation to us all, offering us restoration and transformation. At the King's table, we can find identity beyond our flaws, healing for our wounds, and a new life that goes beyond the brokenness of our past. The invitation is there. Will we accept it? Will we take our seat at the table of grace? Mephibosheth's journey is a remarkable tale of redemption and transformation. Once a forgotten prince living in exile, his life changed forever when he was invited to sit at the King's table. This invitation wasn't just about returning land or wealth. It was about restoring Mephibosheth's identity. For so long, his life had been defined by exile and rejection, his family's fall a burden he could not escape. But in the presence of King David, those markers of his past no longer had a hold over him. David's invitation showed that Mephibosheth's worth was not tied to his mistakes, his injury, or the shame of his family. As Mephibosheth experienced the transformation at the King's table, he realized that grace wasn't about merit. He had not earned his place there. It was given to him because of who he was to David. The king did not look at his physical condition, nor did he hold his family's sins against him. Instead, David saw the man Mephibosheth was meant to be, a man worthy of love, worthiness, and restoration. That table symbolized more than just a seat. It symbolized acceptance, a place where Mephibosheth could rest, heal, and begin anew. The table became a symbol of grace freely given to Mephibosheth. It marked the moment he accepted he was no longer defined by the fall of his family or the hardships of his past. He was welcomed into the king's presence, not because of anything he had done, but because of the love and grace David had shown him. Every meal shared at that table reminded Mephibosheth that he was chosen, valued, and redeemed. The grace extended to him healed not just his body, but his soul, allowing him to accept his new life and identity. But what does it mean when grace reaches beyond our flaws and welcomes us into a place of honor? For Mephibosheth, the table was not just a meal. It was the place where he could finally accept who he was and step into a new identity. The table symbolized restoration, not only of his inheritance, but of his very soul. Every meal shared at that table was a reminder that he was loved, accepted, and valued, not for what he had done, but for who he was, a son of Jonathan, loved by the king. The king's grace didn't just heal the wounds of his body, it healed his heart. What about us? Just like Mephibosheth, we too are invited to the table of grace. The king invites us not because of what we've done or how we've earned it, but because of who we are in his eyes. We too can find identity beyond our flaws, healing for our wounds, and a new life that goes beyond the brokenness of our past. When we sit at the king's table, we embrace transformation. The invitation has been extended to each of us. Will we take our seat at the table of grace and experience the transformation it offers? As we conclude, let us take a moment to come before God in prayer. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes and join me. Lord, we come before you today with hearts full of gratitude for the grace you extend to each of us, just as you did for Mephibosheth. Thank you for calling us to your table of grace, where we can find restoration, healing, and a new identity in you. Help us to embrace your grace fully, knowing that it is not by our merit, but by your love that we are redeemed. May we walk in the fullness of the transformation you offer, and may our lives reflect the grace we've received. Let your love shine through us, transforming our hearts and the hearts of those around us. We are grateful for the seat you've prepared for us at your table. In the name of Jesus, amen. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel to keep following more biblical stories like this one. Your participation is very important to us, and we want to hear your opinions and suggestions. May God bless you.